The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. This is Matt Solomon from Island Press, and welcome to the End of Automobile Dependence webinar with Peter Newman. Glad that you can all tune in today, not only to hear Professor Newman talk about his new book, The End of Automobile Dependence, but also to talk about some of the key themes of the book that might be applied to the transportation and the transit issues that are happening in the Bay Area and other cities across the U.S. So to help guide the discussion today, we're fortunate to have Chris Lepe from Transform as our moderator. I think he'll add a pretty important perspective to the discussion, especially considering the work that Transform is doing to create transit-friendly and equitable communities in the Bay Area. But before we go any further, I do want to call attention to some of our partners for this event. So many thanks to Transform, and thanks to Spur, and thanks to the APA Northern California Sustainability Committee. Thanks to Scott Edmondson and his team there. And also the Transportation and Land Development Committee of the Transportation Research Board. Thanks to John Rennie and his TRB committee. And please also remember that Peter and Jeffrey's book is available for sale. We're offering a 20% discount to those of you who are on the line today. So all you have to do is go to islandpress.org. You can use the promo code 4AUTO to get 20% off Peter and Jeffrey's book and free shipping. Also, a very quick reminder, quick peek into the future. Most of you on the line will be interested to know that our friends at NACTO, they're releasing their new Transit Street Design Guide in April. So for that, you can actually pre-order that. You can go to islandpress.org and you can use the promo code 2NACTO for 20% off that book as well. And just a reminder, the webinar today will be recorded. I'll send a link to the recording within the next day or two. And also a reminder, you can send in questions using the GoToWebinar question function. And time permitting, Peter and Chris will address those questions during their discussion. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, which is Chris Lepe. Chris is the Silicon Valley Senior Community Planner for Transform. Chris engages community leaders, elected officials, transit riders, and the broader community in public transportation plans, projects, and policies such as Plan Bay Area and VTA's Bus Rapid Transit projects. He's the primary organizer for the annual Let's Get Moving Silicon Valley Transportation Choices and Healthy Communities Summit, which is happening this year on May 7th. Chris has done a lot of work implementing community-based input for safe routes to transit in the Mayfair neighborhood in San Jose, organizing a campaign to stop VTA's proposed fare increases in 2003, and many, many other projects. Chris has also taught courses at De Anza College and San Jose State University. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Chris. Chris will say a few words, and he will introduce today's guest speaker, Peter Newman. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Matt. That was quite an introduction, and a pleasure to be here on the webinar with Peter Newman. Is a very renowned professor of sustainability at Curtin University and director of CUSP. Newman has served on the board of Infrastructure Australia and a lead author of Transport on the IPCC's fifth assessment. In 2011, Newman was awarded the Sidney Luker Medal by the Planning Institute of Australia. And was awarded an Order of Australia for his contributions to urban design and sustainable transport. So thank you, Peter, for joining us on the webinar today. I'm looking forward to a great discussion. Again, as the presentation continues on the webinar, to post questions
Hi, Peter. I think Chris's internet connection cut out for just a moment there. So I will I will get your screen so everyone can see it here. So it'll just be 1 second. All right, Peter, and you should have control and we can all hear you.
Okay, I need to get my screen up there. Okay, hopefully you can see my first slide. I am delighted to be on my first webinar. It's 7 years since I was in America, so glad to be beaming my way virtually. I am coming in August. I have a month or so to visit a number of cities to talk about this book and latest developments. Things change pretty quickly in this area, and I will even have new data today to show you. This is our new book, The End of Automobile Dependence. It is really the third in a trilogy, and the trilogy began in 1989 with our book Cities and Automobile Dependence, which put us on the world stage in a way that we hadn't quite expected, but we're very pleased about, because we first defined automobile dependence, and that term has been used ever since in all kinds of planning literature and practice. We began to show real data on cities for the first time. It took us years to collect this data and to show our two core ideas, that we must reorient transport priorities and re-urbanise our cities, themes that we keep coming back to. The reaction to that was substantial, to say the least. We wrote an article in the Journal of the American Planning Association at the same time the book came out, and there was an immediate reaction from Gordon and Richardson, which I'd like to read. NK have written a troubling paper. Their distortions are not innocent, because the uninformed may use them as ammunition to support expensive plans for a central city revitalisation and rail transit projects, or stringent land use controls in a futile attempt to enforce urban compactness. Oh dear, fancy that. Perhaps NK would be well advised to seek another planet, preferably unpopulated, where they can build their compact cities from scratch with solar-powered transit. We realised at that point that not only were we trying to engage in the thinking debate about our cities, but the practice and even the publishing world was very clearly at war with us. So we moved on, and in the second step in the battle, we produced this book with Island Press, who have since been our wonderful supporters in this battle. Sustainability in Cities came out in 1999. It was actually launched by Smart Growth America and others in the White House in 1999. The idea of sustainability was just getting some credibility, reducing footprints whilst improving livability, and we began to show that some cities were actually starting to overcome automobile dependence as part of this agenda. And we began to show a much broader number of cities in our Global Cities database, which by then had reached nearly 100. So we were getting underway. It was like we were beginning to win a few battles. Some cities like Singapore, Hong Kong, Freiburg, Copenhagen, and parts of American cities and Australian cities were starting to show some prospects. The kind of data that we collect is pretty hard to show because the number of cities is significant. But if you just look at this, you can see the black cities being the American cities. Atlanta, there at 103 gigajoules per person of transport fuel, is far and away the worst city in these terms. The American cities all around the 50 mark. Then you come to the Australian cities, which are up there, and Canadian, New Zealand cities, but averaging about half the US cities, then half again to a third the European cities, the green ones. And the one right at the end there is Barcelona. If you look at Barcelona, it's 8 gigajoules per capita compared to 103 in Barcelona, in Atlanta. So those comparisons show how dramatically different cities can be. And I think our contribution to showing the extent of the difference had a big impact. And if you look at the new emerging cities in China and India, they're around about 2. So it's we should never worry about them taking over the world of transport fuel. Density is clearly related to this. So if you look at Barcelona and Atlanta here, Barcelona's 200 people per hectare. It's the densest city in Europe, and Atlanta is 6 people per hectare. Even Perth at 12 is significantly denser. So our graph, which we came up with in the early 80s, and then it's been updated ever since and is extensively used, transport fuel versus density, is an exponential relationship and helped us to define these 3 city types and to show that if densities increase, then you can exponentially decline in car use and transport fuel. So what happened next was took us by surprise. We knew there were some cities beginning to change. Our data showed, and we should have realised this, significant declines in transport VKT or VMT per capita were happening. And in the 90s, this 10-year period, just a 5% increase. We should have realised it was heading for negative territory, but we didn't. And it's very interesting that really by the time we got to produce this book, the empire was collapsing everywhere. We really didn't quite predict that the end of the war was coming. Obviously many battles to come, as in any war, but in terms of a good trilogy, the empire that was controlling the world is collapsing all around us. The data for that is very clear. It's what we show in our book. The peak of car use that occurred 2004-05 in the US and continued to decline. The latest data is showing a little turn up. You can understand why when the price of fuel is so low, and which is of course indicating the part of the end is nigh as well as this phase out and reduction in demand sets in. But it's a long way from where we were in that steep ascent period through the 80s and 90s. Australian cities also declined in car use per capita from 2004 on, and these cities are all our big cities and even small cities, Canberra, Hobart, Darwin even, all began to decline. So there's either something in the water or we are doing something very different in our cities, and clearly we needed to come to terms with that. In Australian cities, that peak car use decline is continuing. This is the latest data showing all the cities together continuing to go down, and if you look at VKT per vehicle, it actually has fallen off a cliff and is dramatically declining. The traffic modelers, on the other hand, are not believing this. This is the latest study that's come out in Australia. I dare say it's also there. What happened then? I just lost you. I'm back again. You can see the growth that they are predicting. This is their high scenario, but it's extraordinary that they continue to believe that if wealth is growing, then car use will inevitably grow. That's the way their models are based, and that is the reality, that it is decoupling. So the causes of peak car, therefore, are really important to try and understand, and we have looked at 4, and I'll go quickly through the data on 4 of these. Peak density decline is the first one, that cities are coming back in. Cultural change, that especially with the millennials, car use per capita is far less fashionable than it was, and the travel time benefits that are now beginning to flow through into our cities as people move from cars to rail, because cities have hit what we call the Marchetti wall, and this is universal. The 4th is that urban space efficiencies in the economy. So the economics of this, this is why it's mainstreaming. People do need face-to-face after all. Firstly then, peak density decline. We have put together this graph. This wasn't in the book, so you're seeing this for the first time. The data was there, but for some reason didn't put the graph in. You can see that from the 80s, 1990, the density began to go up again in all our cities. And that's a decline that had set in for 100 years or more. Each year, cities spreading out, but now coming back in. And the same data is evident across all of our cities in Australia. This is the most recent data we can show. You see the growth in inner Canberra, inner Sydney, inner Brisbane, inner Melbourne, inner Perth. That's where most of the growth is now happening. That's a substantial change from those years of spreading out. The second factor, of course, if densities are going up, car use will go down according to our exponential link. The second factor is that car culture is changing. And if you look at this graph, it's pretty well known in the US. The red is the most recent. The teens, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, they're all declining, but it gets less and less, and then it switches over. And us baby boomers, the 60s and 70s, we're driving more. But as you can see, there's less and less of us, so we're driving to our funerals, but we're disappearing. And the change is quite dramatic when you see that people in public transport and everywhere are using mobile devices for most of that time they're on there. And this is something you can't do while you're driving, or you can only in a minimal kind of way. This is one of the factors, I think, in the cultural change. People value their connections to people, their freedom and their connection. They value it on their mobile devices more than they are valuing the car. So we are seeing cultural change, and there's a lot written about this in Richard, Florida and so on. Cars as though yesterday, the young and the rich leave the guzzlers behind. The kind of data there showing a 23% decline in the first decade of this century amongst the young, that has to be cultural. It's way beyond any kind of structural change to have achieved. And the switches are there, but mostly cities are coming back in. The third factor is travel time benefits, moving away from cars. Not a terribly good way to describe this, but if you get to 1 in this ratio of the speed of transit to the speed of traffic, then you are competing in time. Now, if you look at the overall public transport speed, it's in all cities, it's less than car speeds, because buses slow everything down. But if you look at just rail in the bottom part, most cities in the world have gone to being greater than 1, and in the US it's very close. Australian cities, that switch occurred in the 90s, and it does make a very big difference when rail is available. So what we're finding is that public transport has survived the big downturn, is now the growth area, especially rail. So this is the growth of public transport passenger kilometres in our cities, in our data. They're all going up, and those cities that have the best public transport in Europe and Asia are going up the fastest. So it's set in, and what we are now finding in our data, which we talk about, is that 82 Chinese cities are building metros. The ones they've already built are dramatically successful, like Shanghai with 8 million passengers a day and Beijing with 9 million passengers a day, and that private vehicles are peaking in those cities. And 51 Indian cities now building metros. Modi has announced any city over 1 million will have a metro. And the really significant point is that Middle Eastern cities are building rail for the first time. So in America, the growth has been in heavy rail significantly more than buses, which is slightly in decline, and commuter rail, but most of all in light rail. This is the dramatic increase that has set in, and that's now beginning in Australian cities as well. The reason you can see their attraction politically is very strong, but LRTs are actually cheaper than BRTs in all the American data, in capital cost and in operating cost. So there are very many good reasons, and we go into them in the book and have done for 20 or 30 years in our trilogy, but it's pretty dramatic. The fourth is a new factor which we really only began to tease out in our book: the economics supporting peak car and the regeneration of walking and transit urban fabric. We talk a lot about urban fabric. The reality is the knowledge economy, which is the creative and innovative part of our economy, needs time and space efficiencies. Cities need to be spatially efficient to manage this adaptation to the knowledge economy. So this well-known photograph, if you look at the cars in the top right, left hand there, the significant difference is the amount of space that you can create for doing other more useful things in cities than just filling it with bitumen and metal boxes. The significance is that the time and space efficiencies enable people to meet, and that's a big thing. So what we show in our book is that there is a decoupling that is settling in between car use and GDP. We have turned the corner on this. So in each of the cities, the passenger car kilometres per unit of GDP is now going down. You can look at the we talk a lot about this decoupling theory, and it's important that we decouple in absolute terms, which the US is doing. The GDP is growing, coal consumption is in decline, and oil consumption is in decline. So we don't need these fossil fuels anymore to create the wealth that is needed to make our cities places of opportunity for the future. And that's a major breakthrough. It really is the backbone of why I think we are winning. It does however, have to be recognised, and I was delighted to see this graph that car use is now predicted to officially be in decline per unit of GDP long into the future. So may it be. And some interesting data showing that cities with the most rail investment, like Washington DC and Portland, are showing this decoupling to a greater degree. This is a powerful message. So we collect together things about the knowledge economy. For example, these two statistics, the top 6 most walkable cities in the US have 38% higher GDP, and the 70% of the knowledge economy workers in Boston live in walkable areas. This is a very powerful statement as to why the young and the wealthy are moving back into less car-dependent areas, like the picture in Portland in the Pearl District. And places like Broadway have been transformed due to the wonderful work of people like Jan Gehl and Janet Sada-Khan, but it's now becoming mainstream around the world. For example, central London, where they have done a lot of walkability and management and improvements, the traffic fell 19% in that first decade. And the statement in the Times, that rabid left-wing newspaper, says cafe culture is replacing car culture. The underlying part of this is that effective job density, or density in general, does increase labour productivity. You have a more functional city if you can increase densities, particularly in these centres where the knowledge economy works. The next phase of our book was to look to the future and say, how can we reduce car dependence 50% by 2050? And for this, we invoke what we are now calling the theory of urban fabrics. We didn't realise we had a theory till a wonderful Finnish planner came to see us and work with us, who for 20 years had been applying the work about walking, transit and automobile cities, and said this is a theory that he thinks works. So we have a theory now. Well, the key ideas are that you should rejuvenate the walking city and the transit city urban fabric. But secondly, you need to create more of this walking city and transit city fabric deep into the car-based suburbs. And this is the agenda for Australian and American cities that we share. So the theory of urban fabrics, very simply, is that the 3 cities exist in all cities. Every city has a walking city, a transit city, and an automobile city, in different proportions. A few don't have the automobile city, like Venice, because they're relics from previous era, but most cities have some part, and they overlap, and working them out together is the important thing. And we go into this in some detail in the book. You can see many examples of the way in which cities do show this. This is London showing the walking city, the blue the transit city, and the red their car-based city. In Sydney, the purple area there, which is the wealthiest part of Sydney, is the deep blue, is the old walking city. The green with its corridors going out is the transit city, and then the red areas of the car-based city, which politically now are demanding rail into those corridors and that are not served and getting them. That is the politics now in Australian cities. Melbourne is probably the best example of a city in Australia that has redeveloped its walking city. This is the central area, and in 1994, young Gale, after working in Perth, came to Melbourne, and then he came back in 2004 to see how his work had gone. So they've got 10 years of data, and it is a city that has rejuvenated extraordinarily well. The streetcar system was modernised. It's the biggest streetcar system in the world. But the data on the downtown is dramatic. Let me just go through this quickly. This is the number of people living downtown and how fantastic was the rejuvenation of that. Outdoor cafes, again, dramatic. The laneways, all very run down, old backyard waste areas have become very significant new elements of the knowledge economy. So the data shows dramatic increases, 40% in the daytime, 100% pedestrian activity in the evenings, and stationary activities increased 2 to 3 times. This is a city that has transformed in a decade. The central city. Now they have to do it in all their other centres. So what's the second thing? Create more walking city and transit city fabric deep into the car-based suburbs. For us, we have looked to see if there is any transformative new technology around. I don't think we're going to be riding drones into the city. I think fast rail is probably the most significant thing. Still, it is faster than it ever was. This train on the right is in Perth. It travels at average speed of 90 kilometres an hour, top speed of 130. The fabric that builds around cities in their transport is either tram-based fabric like this in Melbourne or train fabric like this in Vancouver, which is much more what I expect will happen. We will have polycentric cities emerging where centres across the city are going to become more and more significant. In Perth, we had this revival from the 80s on. That's me in 1979 running the campaign to bring back our trains. They closed our rail system down. We won in 1983. They brought it back, and from there on we've expanded our system and gone deep into the car-based suburbs, north and south, where it was never expected to have a train line, and the transport planners said it would fail. It's been very successful. This southern line carries 8 lanes of traffic, and it was significantly cheaper than any other way of doing it. What's happening now is that we are building up centres around each of the stations. This is an area that had no city centre kind of fabric at all. So we're evaluating this now, and we looked very closely at the land values that were created by the train. It increased 42% in 5 years along that line. Our modelling showed that we could have actually built that train line. 60 to 80% of the funding could have come from value capture. And what that's done is open the door to more private sector involvement. Let me explain. This is our Prime Minister riding a train. It's a new light rail in the Gold Coast. Our Prime Minister Turnbull replaced Abbott, who refused to fund any urban rail, Turnbull is a fanatic for urban rail, and he is introducing a radical road and rail funding regime, which we're helping on, and it's based on this. We call it the entrepreneur rail model. Now, this isn't in the book, by the way. This is our new ideas. The old way of building it was that you estimate transit numbers, particularly from buses. You then try to get the finance or funding, mostly from government, and then you try to add a bit of land use at the end, and it often falls off the end, as John Rennie can tell you. This approach we're adopting is you find out where the best redevelopment potential is. You go for the land development opportunities first, because that is the only way you'll get private sector funding. So you get the finance and funding worked out first on that, perhaps even 100% of it from the private sector. And then you estimate your transit numbers. You don't do that until you've got the money sorted. And that makes a huge difference because it locks in an integration of transit and land use that is so hard to do. I believe this is the future, the polycentric city, that we will get these centres building around quality rail systems, whether they be in Silicon Valley or the Central Valley or any part of the automobile-based city across America and Australia. And if you don't do that, you won't get jobs in those areas of great significance. You'll only get consumption economy jobs. We've done detailed studies which are in the book showing how Perth could build for the next 30 years in centres alone, centres and rail-based transit, and it would save a lot of money and greenhouse gases as well as being what the planners want. This is an example of a centre that is going to develop a $7 billion investment in our campus to become a city. There's almost every university in the world wants to get from being a suburban campus to a city. Well, for that you need light rail and you need all these other wonderful things like biophilic urbanism. I'm going to finish by talking about electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles very quickly, because EVs are definitely part of this new zero carbon precinct. Every new precinct needs it. And AVs are very good for the last mile. I showed you this before. If you look at the top left, there's autonomous vehicles, but except they're proceeding a good deal faster. They're supposed to be a metre apart, these 100-mile-an-hour troops, and just imagine that in your city centre. My gosh, that'll never happen. So I think autonomous vehicle technology, however, if you applied it to buses and trains at the two ends of the transit and at the two ends of the transit trips, it could be transformative. You would get BRTs very easily, and you would make trains operate at double the capacity, so you wouldn't need extra tracks. It is a breakthrough on that, but it's not a breakthrough just for cars. The other obvious thing is that AVs and all vehicles should rapidly become electric and renewable, and this is happening because investment in renewables is happening everywhere, and that data is in our book. In Perth, we have had a remarkable transformation. In 3 years, the biggest power station is now rooftop solar, 490 megawatts in 3 years, and it's mostly outer suburbs because they've got the space on their rooftops. The crossover point for solar and batteries is happening in 2016-17, so already the early leaders are showing us how to do that, and this means that coal-fired power is no longer the cheapest option. The batteries are now arriving. They are relatively cheap, and there are examples around the world like the Davis West campus, the Honda Zero Home, and the Tesla stuff. By the way, the Tesla battery is now, we now have cheaper versions than that already available in Perth. And new developments like this at White Gum Valley, WGV, the entire new precinct will be covered in solar and batteries. It will have electric vehicles, and it will be the kind of model for the future. Light rail does not have to have catenaries. It can now have lithium-ion batteries like everything else, and it can suck the electricity out of the station precincts. So we can have what Gordon and Richardson said, solar-powered transit. Let me finish with this picture of the future. When the green economy was struggling in the 80s and 90s, it was hard to see how wealth would separate out from footprint. It is now turned, and wealth is growing as footprint declines. The tipping point, I believe, has happened. What that means for the future is very different, because after the tipping point, the decoupling begins to take off exponentially. Now, if you take the present exponential trends, let me show you what happens. Predictions before the peak were that all of the GDP would keep going up, therefore all the other oil, coal, gas and so on would keep going up. That's pretty poor thinking, because in fact, if you look at the predictions now, they started to turn. GDP is going up, CO2 is going down as oil, coal and gas phase out. So by 2050, getting to 80% reductions are now entirely imaginable as the exponential increases are setting in. And that is the word of hope I'd like to finish on, and which our book explains further. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter. That was very good. And our moderator, Chris, had a little bit of he had some internet issues, but I think he's back on the line. So I will unmute Chris so you guys can discuss the book and some of the issues in the Bay Area. Thanks. And you're on, Chris. Chris, are you there?
Sounds like you might need to
Yes,
say the questions.
I think we might have lost Chris again, but I will leave him unmuted in case he comes back on the line. But I do have a few questions here that our Bay Area partners sent to me ahead of time. So if you'll excuse me just reading them off the page here.
Hello.
Oh, Chris, are you there?
Yes.
Oh, great, Chris. Well, over to you, Chris.
Hello, everyone. Sorry about that. It appears that the internet connectivity out here in Panama is not as good as I had hoped for. So please bear with me here. Sorry, everyone. So we had some great questions proposed by our partners, and so one of the questions that Spur asked was, you discuss a renaissance in urban rail, but American urban rail also suffers from massive deferred maintenance and asset management problem. The result is low levels of service, low reliability, and passing debts onto future generations. What can we do to make sure transit is there when we need it, and what change in practice does this require?
Okay, thanks. Certainly, infrastructure deficits are enormous and overwhelming when you look at them. It's even worse, of course, with roads and bridges, which are reaching the end of their life, and what you do with them is very interesting. We talk about now 22 cities across the world that have taken down freeways because they're no longer needed, particularly in those central areas where they impeded the urban fabric of the walking city or the transit city. So we do have some tough decisions to make, and they're all about the same priorities. What do we favour? There's no doubt in my mind that the rebuilding of rail systems is a lot cheaper to do than rebuilding some of those freeway interchanges and bridges and massive areas of tarmac, and that's one thing that governments can certainly do. But I would like to emphasise that I believe the private sector can unlock funds far more easily to do this, and in doing so we'll need to have more redevelopment opportunities to make money, and that is the way to link the redevelopment, the reurbanisation of our cities with the reorientation of transport priorities. If you can get the finance to be driving this, then I think we can have some breakthroughs in how we can afford it, because the private sector can make money out of land. That's what they do best. But if you link it to these new transit technologies, which activate the opportunities for them to have better land redevelopment, then you're winning across the board.
Yeah, that's great. I know Portland, Oregon has done a good job with that, and something that in the Bay Area we're exploring. VTA is currently looking at value capture as one way of funding the BART to Silicon Valley extension as an additional source of revenue there. So definitely something that we can do better on in regards to transit funding in the Bay Area. One of the other questions that was asked by APA NorCal is that they'd like to hear a little bit about the best practices and future trends in planning for the two biggest non-auto dependent groups, millennials and boomers. Can you elaborate a little bit more about how those two demographics fit into the conversation?
Yeah, I think I've certainly picked on that a fair bit in the book, and certainly in what I said. They are leading the way. The young and the wealthy, as I call them, because us boomers are, you know, we've done pretty well, and but we are coming back into cities rather than going further out, and there are many opportunities created because of that in a more sustainable, resilient, less car-dependent city. But there are also issues, of course, because the poor are going further and further out. So in our book and in other books, we talk about the eco-enclaves emerging with Mad Max suburbs surrounding them. And that's a good Australian analogy for the fury. But the reality is that that is what's happening. So the big issue for us now is to face how to go beyond the traditional urban fabric of the walking city and transit city and build them deep into car-based suburbs. And that requires imagination that has not yet been demonstrated much in America and Australia. But the first signs of it are there. The obvious benefits from building the rail line out to the airport in Washington DC and redeveloping along the way is now coming through. So having that kind of model is what we need, and we've got some examples, as I mentioned, in Perth. We are doing some of that, and it clearly works. It just is not the kind of thing banks and developers and so on have at the top of their agenda, and we need to convince them this is the best way to make money and make our cities work.
Excellent. Well, so another question from Spur, and by the way, for those of you on the webinar, please continue to send in your questions. We'll get to your questions in just a few minutes here. So as we're still planning for cars in the form of road expansions and parking garages, science suggests that structured parking is not needed in terms of investment for the future. How do you suggest having this conversation, which can be difficult at times at the local level, and what do you see, or what do you think is the most compelling evidence so far on this topic?
Yes, it's an ongoing conversation in Perth where we have a lot of park and ride, but that north and south line, which has been so successful, we've gone from 7 million passengers a year to 70 million passengers a year. That dramatic shift has occurred mainly through bus interchange. So 80% of the people riding our rail are interchanging from bus integrated opportunities, not from park and ride. And yet, if you listen to the radio, people say, oh, I can never use the train because there's not enough parking for me. So it is a problem of people looking at their lifestyle and their future, and their whole worldview is dominated by the windscreen of the car still. If you can get people out of their cars at home where they can get into a local bus or an autonomous vehicle that can pick them up, or an Uber or something that gets them to the station first, then you've got a major breakthrough. But so we still have cultural victories to win.
Definitely, and I think for groups like Spur and Transform and the Sierra Club, we trying to make that happen and working on the front lines of that every day. So I'll read one final question, and we can go to some of the questions raised by those on the webinar. Most city boundaries are not the same as transit agency boundaries, and governance is not the same. So, for example, in San Jose, we have one of the largest cities in California, but it's within the context of the county. And so what is a city's role in transit planning, and how can non-transit professionals, such as city council members, better support transit?
I'd to suggest that this entrepreneur rail model that I raised briefly is a way to overcome that problem as well, because by saying that the boundary problem can stop this, it's essentially saying it all depends on government, when it doesn't. If you can encourage a private sector-led proposal, so you ask for bids about where the best redevelopment opportunities are in a city, they will cross those boundaries, and the opportunities to be linked together into a rail that they would actually fund because of the opportunities it unlocks in land development. See, that's not value capture. That's way beyond it. It's an active value capture, and that completely overcomes those political issues, because people want those light rail projects. They also want some centres near them. There may be political problems with the actual developments when you come to it. Every city has that, but the dominance of local governments in America, set up by your forefathers, is something that can be overcome if you get proper private sector involvement. I believe that is the way to break through on this one.
That's great. So I'm going to move on to questions from the audience here, and one of the questions which revolves around parking is the cost of parking incorporated into any of the data that you present on auto dependence of cities?
Yes, we incorporate all of those factors in. You will see that in one of the chapters that we've got that kind of data. The key thing in the work that we summarise on the costs of different scenarios for the future is that it's not so much the cost of the parking in the economy, but the amount of space. If you can free up that space, the dramatic increase in densities and activity that can occur in an area, you just unleash a very different kind of urban form that is much more productive, much more efficient, and these days links directly into the knowledge economy. So it is a very different kind of city that emerges if you start to control parking space.
Mm-hmm. And another question related to parking is, how can we repurpose parking structures? Have you seen examples of them turned into housing, offices, or other purposes successfully?
Mostly they get blown up. They are not, that slight incline or decline that's built into them is often the killer. People don't like sleeping going downhill. It is an issue. They were not designed for the post-automobile world, that's for sure. you can, of course, recycle all that concrete, but there are a few examples of places that have kept and recycled parking structures, but they tend to be those that have got mostly flat structures to build on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recall Vancouver's resurfaced some of their public parking lots, multi-level parking lots with urban farming operations there. It's kind of an interesting way of addressing two issues, which there they've actually reduced the need for parking, which is why they're looking for different ways of addressing or using that space. So I found that, so another question here, I found that the environmental community cannot grasp passenger rail as an issue they can or should support. So essentially there's a lot of interest or support for electric vehicles, but passenger rail and other forms of public transportation, not so much. So it's, I think, partially a comment, but I think, do you have any perspective in that regard, perhaps in messaging to the environmental community as far as the importance of investing in transit?
Well, it is a journey, and if you just start with the pure environmental approach, you may not get there. The benefits of looking at it more globally in terms of phasing out fossil fuels, for example, as a major environmental issue is that you won't do that unless you overcome automobile dependence. So our cities need to change. I think that's been one of our major contributions, to put that on the agenda of every environmental group. When I first started travelling in the US to talk about this in the 80s and 90s, the Sierra Club was fantastic in the work that John Holtzclaw and others did to set up this as an issue, that reorienting transport and re-urbanising the city was a major environmental issue. And we would get 600 or 700 people along to events in San Francisco, down in that area that's mostly dealing with the wonderful wilderness issues that they've won over the years. But this obviously was clearly part of their agenda, and I thank them very much for it. It's been a leadership role from them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and at least speaking for Transform and work in the Bay Area, the extent to which we've been successful in our advocacy is definitely hinged on the partnerships with the environmental community as well as other groups out there. So, and that includes the Sierra Club. So, do you see autonomous bus and trains as being more of an appropriate initial investment than autonomous private vehicles? Is one question that was just asked.
Yes, I do, and however, you'll probably find that they'll go together. The reality is the motor vehicle industry around the world is trying desperately to rejig their future and thrown in their lot with autonomous vehicles. I just don't see them as being appropriate for the majority of corridors or places in the city. However, they can operate in these far-flung suburbs where you clearly need to get to train stations, and that linkage can be done cleverly with ICT and smartphones and so on. But what I really want to see on the agenda, and I haven't yet seen it, is the autonomous bus and autonomous rail taking up this wonderful technology that's been invented for the car, but is far more appropriate for the bus and the train.
Technology.
I lost you there. Matthew, I think we've lost each other.
Okay, sorry about that, Peter. But I do have some questions from the audience here, so I will queue some up here and get them to you. We had an interesting one from Scott Edmondson. And it's in terms of the polycentric urban/regional form you argue as the land use strategy to unlock hidden land value. Has there been any research on varying land use form and density in optimizing the transportation services and system?
Yeah, wow, it sure has. I summarised that back in the 70s when the first studies were being done after the first oil crisis. I remember a study by Romanos back there which was very significantly showing that the polycentric urban form is what would emerge as we phased out oil. So that idea has been around for a long time, and the modelling is it's just overwhelmingly showing that that's the way we must go. I don't know any city in the world that is not heading towards a polycentric model. They all have done the modelling. They all can see that that's the way they should go. The development community are fairly convinced as well. They can make more money back in these centres, that the outer suburbs like occurred in the GFC are very risky developments now. But the problem is looking how to make that investment work, which is why I like the idea of this partnership between a new rail project and the ability to make money out of the urban development around it. That's the partnership that I think makes it feasible to redevelop and create the polycentric city.
Thank you. So here's a interesting question about sort of low-income areas, and it says, how are low-income minority neighborhoods with service workers fitting into this vision? It seems that this would work only if neighborhoods become gentrified.
Well, I think gentrification is something to welcome where you need redevelopment to happen. You do need people to buy property and enable the private developer to make their money, otherwise they won't keep investing in this kind of re-urbanisation. So don't be too down on gentrification, but and many people are, of course, and I have to deal with this all the time, but the key thing is that we build in affordable housing into every part of that strategy. There is no reason why you can't do what Vancouver's done in regulating it for every development, that there is opportunities for social housing to be built in at the same time. It's not that hard to do, but that is one of the key things, that you cannot create a totally divided city. It'll collapse in on itself. But those areas, the poorer parts of our cities, you can have the gentrification way, but you can also have ways in which those areas can be linked into the city through the electric vehicle movement, even getting the low density areas to be more transit oriented with the buses and autonomous vehicles linking together. But don't shy away from gentrification as being ultimately wrong. It is in fact part of the process that we need to encourage.
Right. Another interesting question. Oh, Chris, are you there?
Yes. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Just wanted to kind of, if that's okay, to piggyback on this discussion here, because in the Bay Area, I think while perhaps in some areas a certain level of gentrification is a good thing, I think there's some serious growing pains with the hot economy and the lack of sufficient housing supply and the inadequate housing policies in order to preserve some of the existing affordable housing stock around rail and transit in particular. And so some of the, I think when it comes back to ridership and on the transit system, one thing that Transform has been really trying to encourage is sort of the inclusion of more affordable housing near transit as a way to boost transit ridership and thereby reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we've, studies have shown that if you can preserve that affordable housing near transit, that actually ridership does fare better than if you end up gentrifying those communities. So just kind of wanted to put our own angle on it and see if Peter, you have any response to sort of that perspective there.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think it's wonderful what Transform is doing, and I really hope to visit you in August this year as part of my tour to see some of this work and to talk to some of your groups. I think it is a particularly San Francisco type issue to have, that you've got a lot more wealth generation occurring out in those suburbs than many other cities. So yeah, that gentrification issue is a real one. I think the combination is certainly needed. There will be some areas that it's important to keep the low-income housing in an effective way. But if it's falling apart, if the whole fabric of the area is falling apart, you do need money to be invested. And the key thing is that you keep the people in that area. And that's a matter of getting developers and designers and community engagement specialists to work with them in partnership so that they can all benefit. They can all keep living there as well as the investment occurring.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think part of the issue in the Bay Area, you mentioned that perhaps we're a little bit of an anomaly to the rest of, or at least other areas in the United States. I mean, it's just the job growth has been outpacing housing growth, and so the pains are quite real here at the ground level, and something a lot of people are thinking about. And so. Yeah, thanks for providing that perspective. There's another question here that I think is also a really good one, which is most of the ridership estimates can be inflated in order to get funding here in the U.S. And the writer here says that I can provide several examples, such as the Detroit People Mover, even the proposed high-speed rail in California. What is your comment on this? And I'll add a little bit to the mix here that there was a recent Los Angeles I think it was a Los Angeles Times article that noted that there have been some ridership declines in cities like LA recently over the last few years, even as rail investments have increased. So anyway, just kind of piggybacking a little bit on what this sort of listener has posed as far as a question, and I know that conflicts a little bit as far as the looking at specific projects with your larger global study here, but what's your response there?
Yeah, look, we have lived through the era where rail projects overstated their patronage potential in order to get funded. That was an era where we were not able to demonstrate significant reductions in car use, but that era is essentially over. I find that the data are showing more and more that the growth in patronage is outstripping anything predicted. The dramatic increase in public transport use in just about every city is it's certainly much more outside America than inside, but it is still, there's many examples of new rail projects that are doing better than expected. There will, of course, be some that don't, and maybe we're going to be struggling with this really cheap fuel for a while, but I think the demand for faster rail projects that can go around, under and over the traffic is very substantial, and that if we can do the urban development around the stations, if we can make the integrated links to bus and or autonomous vehicles, small buses, whatever, linking it into them, the integrated system, then we'll continue to grow, because I think it's inherent now in the structure of the city that that's what it needs. If we continue to think that the automobile dependent city is a better one, then you're going to be in the minority, I think. Or those cities will collapse.
Yeah, and I think at least within Silicon Valley, there's a few different examples where perhaps we might point to, and I think some folks look at the light rail system here, historically as not being as well performing as had been hoped, and ridership estimates didn't materialize as had been projected. On the flip side of that, though, Caltrain is, just from the introduction of the baby bullet plus the economy that I mentioned earlier, has been experiencing huge ridership increases, and it's actually doubled the ridership that it was just a few years ago. And
Ba-ding.
has been increasing over the last few years as well. So anyway, wanted to just kind of like note that little bit dichotomy here in Silicon Valley in terms of people's experiences, something that I work on quite a bit here. And so I don't know if you have anything to say on that. It just sounds like there's a multitude of different factors that contribute to whether rail-based transportation really works, including the fuel prices and the development around it.
Yeah. Look, I won't add anything more. I think the multitude of factors is there. Globally, the dramatic increase in rail in places like China and India, most of the Latin American cities we've looked at, in Europe and in Australia, it's pretty significant. The growth is on.
Hi, Peter. I think unfortunately, I think we might have lost Chris again.
Hello?
Chris. Oh, you keep
Hey.
popping back in when I think I've lost you.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's okay.
Can you hear me now?
We can't
Okay.
we can't hear you now. Okay, good.
Good. Okay. So hopefully you heard the question there, everyone. But what can be said about Australian cities such as Brisbane in comparison to the larger U.S. cities in relation to automobile usage versus having a higher dependency on public transport systems?
Well, yeah, I can talk a lot about Australian cities if you want. I just presented Perth because that's my city, and I've been involved in the changes. It's pretty dramatic. The politics here, we've had 5 elections where the #1 issue was public transport, the state government elections, and in Brisbane they have spent $10 billion in recent years on bus rapid transit systems. They're very expensive ones, and the public transport has not grown anything like it has in Perth and Melbourne, which are the big growth cities in public transport. So there is a local government election coming up. City of Brisbane covers most of that city, and the mayoral candidate that looks as though he's got a good chance is suggesting light rail is now on the agenda for them. So the BRTs, of course, always raise their head there, and they are certainly of value in some places, but I think when they become so ideological that they replace rail projects that are very obviously needed to help regenerate areas, that's a problem, and that's happened in Brisbane. So we have a massive new light rail project in Sydney. The Gold Coast has built theirs. That's a smaller town, 500,000. Big Gold Coast light rail project. Canberra, small city, is building light rail. Newcastle, Parramatta, Adelaide has extended their light rail, and light rail's on the agenda here, but struggling to get a Guernsey at the moment because it's we've just run out of money. So my entrepreneur rail model suggestion has had considerable support from the Prime Minister, who wants to find a new way of bringing private capital into the public transport system. Now, that wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been a market for it. The reality is people see we have to have different cities which are less car dependent, and the politicians can see it, the private sector can see it, but we need to unlock the mechanism for it. How do we get new light rail, heavy rail projects in partnership with land redevelopment in centres? And that is the agenda. If we can work out the politics of doing that, the processes of doing it, then we've got a major breakthrough. And I'm still hopeful that we can do that.
Sounds good. I'm sorry, I actually cut out again, but I think it's just about time here for us to conclude the webinar. But wanted to give the floor to Peter and see if there's anything that you wanted to add. I found that there was, I think, one really great quote in your book, which says that it gives hope and initiative to us here that auto dependence is something that can and is being reversed, and I think your research is helping to prove that. Feel free to just sort of conclude here and wrap up things for us as we go on our way for more less auto-dependent cities.
Thank you, and I really am very pleased that there were over 200 people signed up for this. I hope there's been that many actually come on board. It's very encouraging. The processes of change are best understood when you actually visit a city, so I'm really looking forward to coming in August and seeing a whole series of American cities again to see the extent to which you are winning this battle. It's a hearts and minds battle, it's a political battle, and it's certainly one that academics can assist with, but in the end it comes down to wonderful groups like Transform and the Sierra Club and all of the good work that the TRB is doing and the other people around the table here. So if you want me to come and help you by a visit where I can dramatise these issues to your politicians and media, I can do that. I'm very pleased to get any offers of which cities would like me to come. You can email Matthew if you like, or direct to me. But I would really appreciate the opportunity to visit America again and to document some of the great stories and to help encourage a longer-term future for our cities that is well underway, but still plenty of battles to win. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And Matt, did you want to kind of say any final thoughts here? You're on, Matt.
Thanks, Chris. I just wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank Peter for just a great discussion. I think we covered a lot of ground today. We learned a lot about Peter's work and his research, and I think the discussion helped to shed some light on some of the transit issues that we're having in general. But yeah, again, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. Also, just a reminder to pick up Professor Newman's new book, The End of Automobile Dependence. You can get it at islandpress.org for 20% off. You can use the promo code again, 4auto. And again, thanks very much to Chris Lepe from Transform and Professor Peter Newman for a great discussion. Thank you for tuning in, and good night to everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.